My father was not a warm man. He was precise, calculated. He wore the same gray blazer to every family dinner, ordered the same meal at every restaurant, and gave the same measured hug at every birthday. You always knew exactly where you stood with him, or at least, I thought you did. He died on a Tuesday in October. Cardiac arrest. 62 years old, still at his desk, still with a pen in his hand. The kind of death that felt almost scripted for him. Clean, decisive, no loose ends. Except there was one. One very large, very expensive, very mysterious loose end. And her name was Maria. I'm Natalie. I'm the oldest of three. My brother Dean is 2 years younger than me, and my sister Cora is the baby. She was 24 when all of this happened. We grew up in a nice suburb outside of Columbus. Dad was a commercial real estate developer. Mom passed when Cora was 11. It was just the four of us after that, and Dad ran our family the same way he ran his business, with spreadsheets, schedules, and absolutely no room for emotional surprises. Which is why, when his estate attorney called us into a downtown office 3 weeks after the funeral and slid a document across the glass table, the words on that page felt like something had physically struck me in the chest. The attorney's name was Gerald. He wore a tie that was slightly too short for his body. He didn't look at us when he explained it. He just kept his eyes on the document and read in a flat, professional voice. The primary beneficiary of the estate, the house, the investment portfolio, the commercial properties, the entirety of the liquid assets, was a woman named Maria Volkov. We were each left a symbolic sum of $20,000 and a single handwritten sentence. I trust you will understand in time. The chair scraped the floor as Dean stood up. Cora made a sound like the air had been knocked out of her. I just stared at the number, the 20,000, like a tip, like my father had left us a tip on the way out the door. Now, you have to understand, we weren't broke. Dean had his own career, I had mine. It wasn't about the money. It was about what the money meant. My father had spent 30 years building that portfolio. We had watched him. We had watched him skip vacations, drive the same car for 12 years, reuse paper clips, and he gave it all, every last cent, to a name none of us had ever heard. Maria Volkov. Dean Googled it in the parking garage before we even reached our cars. There were a few results, nothing specific, nothing that matched Columbus or real estate or anything connected to our father. Cora was crying. I wasn't. I was doing something much more dangerous than crying. I was thinking. I asked Gerald for any contact information the estate required us to have. He gave me an address, a property address, and when I typed it into my phone, I felt the first cold ripple of understanding move through me, because the address he gave me was in a neighborhood called Bexley, a wealthy pocket of Columbus, a neighborhood where my father owned rental properties, a neighborhood where, it turned out, he also owned a house he never mentioned to his children. I drove there that same afternoon. I didn't tell Dean or Cora. I parked across the street and sat there for 40 minutes. The house was beautiful. Pale brick, black shutters, a garden in full autumn color. A child's bicycle leaned against the porch rail. And as I watched, the front door opened and a woman stepped out to retrieve a package from the steps. She was tall, dark-haired, maybe 50, maybe a well-preserved 55. She wore a cardigan and moved with the easy, unhurried confidence of someone who had lived in a place for a very long time. She glanced at the street, glanced directly at my car, it felt like, and went back inside without any particular reaction. I drove home with my hands shaking on the wheel. Here is what I knew by the end of that week, after phone calls, property record searches, and one very uncomfortable conversation with my father's business accountant, who clearly knew far more than he wanted to admit. Maria Volkov had been in my father's life for at least 15 years. 15 years. He had purchased the Bexley house 12 years ago, and she had been living in it ever since. The property taxes, the maintenance, the utilities, all run through a subsidiary LLC that sat quietly beneath 3 layers of his corporate structure. He paid for private school tuition, he paid for a car lease, renewed every 3 years, he paid for what appeared to be the entire comfortable life of a woman and her family that we did not know existed. The child's bicycle on the porch was not a coincidence. Maria had a daughter. She was 9 years old. Her name, I would eventually learn, was Sasha. And when I pulled the girl's birth certificate, which took a private investigator and another 2 weeks, the father listed was not my father's name. It was blank. Dean's response when I told him was to immediately contact a litigation attorney. His theory, and it was not an unreasonable one, was that Maria was a manipulator, a predator who targeted a lonely widower, inserted herself into his life, and systematically positioned herself to inherit everything. He used words like undue influence and elder financial abuse and we can fight this. Cora's response was to stop eating and stop answering her phone for 4 days. My response was to go back to Gerald, the estate attorney, and ask him a very specific question. Not who Maria was, not how to contest the will, just one question. How long had my father known about this? Gerald looked at me for a long moment across his glass table. Then he said, very quietly, that he had been my father's attorney for 19 years, and the bequest to Maria was in every version of the will for the last 14 of those years. 14 years. 14 years of deliberate, repeated, considered choice. This was not a deathbed manipulation. This was a plan my father renewed every time he sat down to update his estate documents. This was not something done to him. This was something he chose. I hired the investigator to keep working. I needed to understand not just who Maria was, but who she was to him. Because the more I sat with what I knew, the more I realized the story Dean was telling, the predator narrative, the victimized widower, didn't quite fit. My father was not a man who got swept away by anything. He wasn't impulsive. He wasn't lonely in the soft, vulnerable sense. He was strategic to his core. So what was Maria? The investigator's name was Tom. He was a former insurance fraud examiner who now worked mostly domestic cases, and he had the specific energy of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything a long time ago. He called me on a Thursday morning with what he described as the part that changes the shape of it. Maria Volkov had immigrated from Bulgaria 20 years ago. She arrived with no English, no money, and a 2-year-old daughter, a daughter from a previous relationship, a daughter that was not and had never been connected to my father biologically. She had cleaned offices for 4 years. She had put herself through night school for 2 more. She had, by the time my father apparently met her at a commercial property showing, built herself into a licensed property manager running contracts with several small development firms. She was not a predator. She was not a grifter. She was a woman who had worked herself out of nothing and built a quiet, dignified, completely hidden life alongside my father for 15 years. And he hid her from us. Not because he was ashamed of her. Tom found emails, old ones, backed up on a server my father's IT firm still maintained. And in those emails, my father wrote about Maria with a softness I genuinely never heard in his voice. He called her his peace. He called their evenings together the only hours in his week that felt like rest. He hid her from us because he knew what we would do. He knew Dean would lawyer up. He knew Cora would collapse. I knew I would start asking questions, and he had spent 15 years protecting her from us. The inheritance wasn't a betrayal. It was a wall he built to keep her safe after he was gone. That realization did not arrive gently. It arrived at about 2 in the morning on a Sunday when I was sitting at my kitchen table with Tom's files spread in front of me, and I felt something shift in my chest that I can only describe as the specific grief of realizing your understanding of someone was wrong in a way that cannot be corrected. My father had a whole life, a whole beautiful, quiet, careful life that he chose never to share with us. And the question I kept returning to, the one that kept me awake, was not why didn't he tell us? I understood that. I could see the geometry of it. The question was, what did that mean about us? What had we been to him that he needed to wall off the best parts of himself so completely? I met Maria in November, 5 weeks after the will reading. I called the number Gerald had for her, and she answered on the second ring. I introduced myself. There was a silence that lasted long enough to be its own entire conversation. Then she said, in an accented but careful English, "I wondered when you would call." We met at a coffee shop near her house. She was composed in a way that I recognized. It was the composure of someone who had been bracing for this a very long time. She had a folder with her. Inside were photographs. My father at a kitchen table with a birthday cake. My father laughing, genuinely laughing, in a way I had almost never seen in my entire life, at something happening off camera. My father kneeling in that garden with the autumn colors, his sleeves rolled up, dirt on his hands, looking like someone I had never met. She slid them across the table to me and let me look. She didn't apologize. She didn't defend. She said, "He was a good man. He was complicated. He loved all of you very much. He just didn't know how to be the version of himself that he was with me when he was also being your father." I asked her if she knew he was going to do what he did, leave everything to her. She said he had told her years ago. She said she had argued against it. She said he had been immovable. Dean went ahead with the contest. He filed on grounds of undue influence and lack of capacity. The process lasted 8 months, cost enormous amounts of money, and ultimately failed. The court found the will valid in every respect. My father had been of completely sound mind. He had executed the same bequest repeatedly over 14 years. There was nothing to overturn. Dean stopped speaking to me when I declined to add my name to the filing. He said I had betrayed the family. I told him I thought he had the wrong person in that sentence. Cora and I had a different kind of reckoning. She came to stay with me for a weekend in January, and we stayed up until 4 in the morning talking about our father in ways we had never allowed ourselves to talk before. About the coldness, about the precision, about the long silences at dinner, and the way praise in our household had always felt like a transaction. About how much we had wanted from him, and how consistently we had received something slightly less than what we needed. And then Cora said something that I think about constantly. She said, maybe he knew he couldn't be everything. Maybe the kindest thing he thought he could do was make sure the part of him that actually worked was taken care of. I don't know if that's forgiveness. I don't know if it's even close to forgiveness. But it was the first time the thing in my chest felt like something other than a wound. I have spoken to Maria 3 times since that coffee shop. We are not close, and I do not know if we ever will be, but she is not the villain of this story. She never was. She was just a woman my father loved in the only way he apparently knew how, quietly, carefully, and completely out of sight. Sasha, her daughter, is 10 now. She knows my father as the man who was kind to her mother. She knows nothing about inheritance or lawsuits or the cold arithmetic of an estate. I think my father would have wanted it that way. Whether I have made peace with that, with the $20,000, with the 14 years of deliberate erasure, with the version of my father that existed in that pale brick house with the autumn garden, is a question I don't have a clean answer to yet. What I do know is this: he trusted us to understand in time. That was what the note said. And some days, on the good days, I think I'm starting to. And on the other days, I think the most honest thing I can say is that understanding something and being okay with it are 2 very different things. And maybe that's fine. Maybe that's just what it looks like to be someone's child, after everything. If this story cracked something open in you, If it made you think about the people you thought you knew and the parts of themselves they kept hidden, I want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this one, real, complicated, the kind that don't tie up cleanly, subscribe, because there are so many more where this came from.